Hello and welcome to the University of Nottingham and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Today I'm in conversation with John Milbank, our Professor of Religion, Politics and Ethics, and we're going to be chatting, John, about possibly the greatest theologian of the Christian tradition, claimed by both Catholics and Protestants, St. Augustine of Hippo, who was born in the 4th century in North Africa, what today is Algeria, in a city known as Thagaste. I know that Augustine has been very influential in your own work, going back to theology and social theory. I wonder if you could give us a flavour of what's so important about Augustine for your thought.
Yes, well, I don't know whether Augustine is necessarily the greatest Christian theologian, but I think he's certainly one of the very greatest. I suppose I think there are two things. I mean, first of all, I think his theology of the Trinity. I think it's Augustine who gradually builds up to the idea that the persons of the Trinity are substantial relations. In other words, that they are through and through relational. Right. That the Father is only the Father in giving the Son, and the Son is only the Son in being receiving his sonhoodship from the Father. And then Augustine has the idea that that is reflected in human life. It's sometimes talked of as the psychological analogy for the Trinity. I think that's rather inadequate. I think it's more about the interplay of the human interior with the human exterior, or the social with the psychological, if you like. That relationship is inside us, and at the same time we're given outwards into relationship. And then I suppose the second thing that I'm most influenced by in Augustine is his work on the city of God, or so his understanding that the church is both a community in heaven and it's a community in pilgrimage on earth, travelling through the ages, and it transcends the state in that respect. And it's trying to reflect the idea that there is an original peace, that the violence in the world is a contingency introduced by our fallenness, by original sin. The more fundamental ontological situation is one of peace and harmony. This is partly why for Augustine evil is something negative and privative, and I think that's equivalent to saying that evil and violence are really identified with each other. It's an interruption of something more basic, and peace is always more basic because holding together is always more fundamental than pulling things apart, even though paradoxically holding together is more fragile and difficult. And I think and I think this is the way the church lives, that it's trying to build things up by fragility. It's trying, if it can, to pursue the path of peace and the path of reconciliation beyond merely the path of law and coercion. And so I think it's very important here that for Augustine, the pagan virtues are finally linked to a kind of political or military control of the passions. There's always an analogy for him between the soul and the city, if you like. Whereas the Christian virtues are not to do with suppressing the passions, but with transforming the passions. So this is primarily to do with love, so that you convert all our desires into measured desires, or desires for the right thing. So it's a much more ambitious approach to ethics, and I think this is why Augustine says that the pagan virtues were but glittering vices. Yes. You know, and similarly he applies that politically, that it's not about dominating your enemy, even in the name of injustice. And Augustine is by no means as against the Roman Empire as he's sometimes presented, but he does want to totally transform it and into something more like an international commonwealth, where you stop having this excuse of oppressing your enemies, and you're trying to persuade people to live in terms of justice and charity, and you're more aiming for something like an international harmony. Not that Augustine is optimistic about this, but I think Augustine is somehow able to combine the sense that humans tend towards decline with, at the same time, the growth of something else. And I think this may be very important for us today.
So Augustine, during his ministry, he was a bishop in North Africa, in Hippo. He was quite famous for getting involved in a number of different debates. I guess most famously the debate against the Pelagians and this sort of voluntarism. What was Augustine's response to the Pelagians and this controversy?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to talk about the late Augustine. In many ways, for most of Christian history, maybe until you get to the Reformation, people were a little bit uneasy about the late Augustine and tend to concentrate on the early Augustine. The early Augustine is somebody who's synthesizing Christianity and a Neoplatonic outlook, and is stressing our participation in eternal truth and goodness and beauty, and the idea that that participation is restored by the incarnation. And all of that is sort of not incompatible with the Greek outlook, stressing that God became man in order that we become God, we become deified, that sometimes Augustine uses that word. But in his late phase, he seems to talk much more about a kind of arbitrary act of grace performed by God, and to start talking in terms of predestination, and even arguably double predestination.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, the strange thing, and this is a complicated exegetical problem, the strange thing is actually the De Trinitate, which belongs to the late period, really seems in many ways more like the early writings, that it thinks in Pythagorean and Neoplatonic ways about the underlying realities of creation. But nonetheless, there is this problematic late period. Now, I think certainly in refuting Pelagius, Augustine is sort of denying a model of choice that would be almost like a sort of proto-liberal model, you know, all a bit too English, you know, common sense, rather than so the idea that sort of freedom is a pure act of choosing under your own command, rather than the idea that you're always in a certain kind of habit, you're always kind of overwhelmed by certain kind of forces. So in a sense, for Augustine, you cannot but choose the good if you're receiving grace, if grace overwhelms you. But to choose the good is to choose the end that sets you free, because you're no longer controlled by passions and so forth. So the idea that there would be a kind of space that is our freedom in relation to God is ridiculous, because it's just not a zero-sum game. You know, God is the author of everything. He is the author of all good. Now, where I think Augustine gets into more trouble is where he sort of abandons metaphysical sophistication when it comes to evil, and seems to suggest that this equally applies to divine decisions about evil and so forth. So, for example, when he says that punishment comes from God, and maybe election to damnation comes from God, this isn't really consistent with the heart of his metaphysics. This is exactly what John Scotus Erigena says in the 9th century. He says God doesn't punish, because punishment, even though it's a relative good, is also a relative evil. It's an act of necessary evil, and evil, if evil is wholly privative, then it's never coming from God at all. But all punishment is self-punishment. All punishment is the consequence of evil, and similarly, God isn't damning anybody. People are only self-damned. And the implication of that would be, for Erigena and for others, that when you escape from the illusion of evil, you escape from the illusion of self-damnation. So finally, there is no hell if God, I mean, either either we can hope that everybody finally delivers themselves from that, or one could even go further, that if God is God, if God is really omnipotent, then somehow in the end, as for Origen, Erigener and other writers, there is no hell. Yeah. Same logic sort of followed by somebody like Schalpegi in modern times, and I think almost followed by people like Balthasar Ratzinger, but they're afraid of going quite that far. So I think that the whole business in late Augustine that suggests, that some kind of arbitrary election on the part of God. But if you question that, I think you also question punishment and final damnation.
Fascinating stuff. We could go on for a very long time. It's time to say goodbye, and thank you very much for joining us at the University of Nottingham.